White background. Cost? $0. In a recent Q&A episode, someone requested I shoot using a white background. I got quite a few emails asking, how did I shoot that white background? And it's really quite simple. I grabbed a white sheet and ironed it and draped it over my green screen. I used my cheap green screen ties to pull the sheet taut, but that's not necessary. You can run your hands over the sheet and get most of the wrinkles out. That was pretty much it. You can use white paper, muslin, and all sorts of things. What makes it look legit is your lights and how you adjust your camera settings. I have a couple of DIY lights I use for green screen. You can use anything really, even cheap can lights. Just light the heck out of the sheet. What happens is all the imperfections disappear. Here's the background lights off, where you can see all the imperfections in the sheet. Here it is on. Off. On. The trick is setting the camera up properly, and that's just a matter of adjusting your ISO, your aperture, and looking at it on your computer. I had a feeling this would be a question, so I happened to shoot the following footage while setting it up for the last episode. All right, this is the first test. The AC is running and there's a bunch of stuff going on. I don't care because this is just a test. I'm not testing the sound, I'm testing the screen. Two things I'm looking at is first I'm shooting at 23.976 frames per second, 24 frames a second. The shutter speed is set to 50. If I'm shooting on a green screen, I'll up the shutter speed to about 80 because then I'll get motion blur. And when I try and key out the motion blur when I do that, it will be really bad. So I keep the shutter speed at about 80. I cover that in a whole nother video. For now, what I'm trying to do is I have this big pile of white behind me, and it's just a reflective sun pile of white. And so trying to get your camera set up, the correct ISO and the correct aperture look, mainly the ISO, is tough because the camera's going, whoa, you're shooting light into me, and I don't understand. So I have a light here and a light here, and I have a hair light up there. I have two lights on the side that are lighting this back white panel here. And now I have to set this thing up. So here's how I do that. I like to keep the aperture between 3.2 and about 4.0, generally. This screen back here, I'd say that screen back there is maybe a good 6 feet, 7 feet, maybe 8 feet. And if I set the aperture to like really high, like 11, any wrinkles or things I have on that screen are going to show up. So I like to keep the aperture between like 3.2, 3.0, and 4.0. I generally 3.2 to 4.0. Now what I've done is I've set the aperture to 3.2, set the ISO to 320. That's what you're looking at right now. I don't know if that's going to look good until I bring it in my computer. So here's what I do. ISO 320, aperture 3.2. ISO is still 320. Now I've set the aperture to 4.0. Let's move up the ISO. The ISO I've just set up to my next increment on my camera from 320 to 400. I've left the aperture at 4.0. ISO is still at 400. The aperture was now dropped to 3.2. That looks fairly bright. It's ISO 500 and the aperture is still at 3.2. Let's move the aperture to 4.0 and it will darken just a bit. All right, that's still ISO at 500 and the aperture at 4.0. What I'd like to get is I'd like to get the perfect aperture and the ISO at 3.2 or 4.0, preferably 3.2, whatever looks best on me, because I don't care about that white because it's just a big pile of white. So anyway, right now 500, 4.0, we're gonna do 2 more. Let's move the ISO down. No, we already did that. Let's move the ISO up to the next increment, which from 500 on this camera, 640. Yeah, that's pretty bright. At least on my monitor, on my camera. It could be fine. I don't know. I'll have to look at it, which is the whole purpose for doing this. The ISO is at 640. The aperture is at 4.0. Last test. I know it's going to be too bright, I think. I'm going to move the aperture down to 3.2. That looks really bright. That's ISO 640 and aperture 3.2. Now I'm going to take it into my computer and look at it. And I'm going to see on my computer where I look the best lit and I get the best white background. These are the kind of tests you do just to check things out and see what the right setting is. Once I've nailed it, as far as this white background, it doesn't matter. I already know if I pull this white background up, there's a green screen behind there. I already know from shooting in this environment, which is why I shoot in here, that looks terrible. Let me turn that back down. Yeah, it looks right to me. ISO 400 and aperture 3.2. That's what looks right to me, but I won't see until I get it in the computer. Now again, I know when I pull this up and off, it's all stretched and stuff. I know that on green screen shooting in this room with this light setup, I absolutely know that I set the ISO to 640. I set the aperture to 3.2. And I set the shutter speed to 80. If I move the shutter speed from 50 to 80, it's going to darken it down some. I move the shutter speed to 80, as I said before, because I don't get motion blur, and when I try and key out the green of motion like that, it's nearly impossible. So what I'm trying to determine is when I flip this up, okay, good. ISO 640, aperture 3.2, shutter speed 80. When I flip this down for a white background, now what do? Now what I mark down for that? And that's all I'm trying to determine for these tests. It's a test that you can also do to check these different things that you have, basically aperture and ISO, to get the ISO as low as you can, which gives you the cleanest footage, and the aperture enough to where your background smooths out, if that's what you want. Let's go check it in the computer and see what we got. That's really all there is to it. Grab a white sheet, drop it over your existing setup, or make a frame out of electrical conduit, or just pin or tape the sheet to a wall. Throw a bunch of light at it, take a bunch of shots at different ISO and aperture settings, bring it into your computer and see which one works. If you want to shoot with something else, roll the sheet up or pin or tape it up until later. You could do this with any color sheet, and it is certainly the cheap way to go. Please click that subscribe button to help support the channel, and don't forget to check out the online training over at basicfilmmakeruniversity.com. I hope that helps. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. It takes the imperfections out of the white background. Here it is with them off. Okay. That wasn't the right off. No. I guess I'm going goodbye. Bye.